What happens when one nation's ambition becomes everyone's anxiety? What happens when years of talks, sanctions, and warnings fail, and the red line isn't a theory anymore, but a detonator waiting for a finger? We stand at a crossroads where decisions made, or delayed, will define not just a decade, but possibly a century. When Iran becomes a nuclear power, the global security blueprint gets torn up. But the bigger tragedy isn't just a new weapon in one country's arsenal. It's that we, humanity, lose the only advantage we've ever had in avoiding catastrophe, time. Once a nation masters nuclear weapons technology, there's no undoing that knowledge. The blueprints don't vanish. The scientists don't forget. The infrastructure doesn't disassemble itself. That's what makes nuclear proliferation so uniquely dangerous. It's not just a political event. It's a permanent shift in what a nation is capable of, and that shift affects everyone, not just its immediate neighbors. We've seen over decades how fragile the global system becomes once even one new player joins the nuclear club. The world didn't become more secure when more countries acquired weapons of mass destruction. It became more anxious, more reactive, and more invested in containment strategies rather than forward-thinking development. The moment a state crosses the nuclear threshold, they introduce a layer of risk that diplomacy, sanctions, and military deterrence struggle to manage, especially over long periods. There's a common illusion that nuclear deterrence creates balance. But history suggests the opposite. Every new entrant creates ripple effects, sparking arms races, undermining treaties, and pushing others to question their own restraint. The psychological shift is immediate. Suddenly, any diplomatic standoff carries the weight of existential consequences. Misunderstandings become potentially catastrophic. Bluffs become far more dangerous, and negotiations, which once had flexibility, are now bounded by red lines no one dares cross. In the case of Iran, what makes this threshold even more consequential is the geopolitical context. It's not just one nation gaining a new weapon. It's one of the most politically charged regions on the planet being pushed into a new strategic era. And this isn't just about adversaries. This will deeply affect allies too. The regional balance that's held together through fragile arrangements, some public, some private, would almost certainly collapse into a new set of calculations. Saudi Arabia has already hinted at matching capabilities if Iran goes nuclear. Others might quietly begin their own programs under the surface of international visibility. Before long, the non-proliferation regime that's held since the Cold War becomes symbolic instead of functional. The technical knowledge behind nuclear weapons is not rare anymore. What stops most countries is political will and international pressure. Once you remove the taboo by allowing a breakout case, especially a high-profile one, you weaken both the will and the pressure. And what's concerning is how quickly this process can snowball. Countries begin hedging, acquiring dual-use technologies, enriching uranium just below weapons grade, investing in missile systems for defense. And by the time global oversight kicks in, the capability is already within reach. There's another cost we don't talk about enough: the long-term opportunity cost. Nations that pursue nuclear weapons often do so at the expense of everything else: education, healthcare, infrastructure, climate resilience. The focus becomes one-dimensional: protect the state. But that logic ironically makes the state more isolated, more vulnerable to sanctions, more dependent on a security first posture that drives away investment and global collaboration. Nuclear weapons promise security, but often breed insecurity, both internally and externally. For the global community, allowing another nuclear state is not just about accepting one new threat. It's about sending a message that the system doesn't work. That if you wait long enough, endure the pressure, and play the long game, you too can join the club. That's the irreversible part. Once that message lands, it's not just Iran we're dealing with, it's the next 5 nations watching and learning. This is not to argue that countries don't have real security concerns. Many do, but nuclear weapons don't solve those concerns. They freeze them. They make dialogue harder, not easier. They cement power structures rather than reforming them. They're a shortcut to fear-based diplomacy where the strongest voice gets heard regardless of the logic behind it. The world has made real progress over the decades in reducing the total number of nuclear weapons. Bilateral agreements, disarmament efforts, inspections, they've all played a role, but all of that can be undone with one high-profile failure. Iran crossing the line would undo decades of momentum, just as we need collective action more than ever on climate, on pandemics, on economic fairness. Proliferation isn't just a technical concern or a regional one. It's a foundational issue that challenges how nations coexist. Once the nuclear line is crossed, it stays crossed. The world becomes permanently more volatile, less rational, and more reactive. That's not just a strategic loss, that's a generational one. There's a tendency to assume that the Middle East has always been unstable, as if conflict is a permanent feature of its geography. But that's a misleading simplification. Beneath the surface tension, there exists a web of informal understandings, economic partnerships, and shared interests that have kept full scale wars from erupting more frequently. This fragile equilibrium, based on deterrence, diplomacy, and mutual self-interest, has allowed countries in the region to pursue growth, attract investment, and build new alliances, but introduce a nuclear weapon into that equation, and the balancing act begins to crumble. The concept of balance in a non-nuclear region is built on conventional deterrence, missiles, air power, and influence through proxies. It's an ecosystem that nations understand, with rules that have evolved over decades. But a nuclear weapon isn't just another tool, it's a destabilizer. Its mere presence changes the calculations of every neighboring country. Leaders no longer assess risk based on traditional ground or air combat, but instead on the unthinkable, total annihilation. That leads to faster decisions, more miscalculations, and far greater consequences. The first shift happens psychologically. If a country like Iran crosses the nuclear threshold, its regional adversaries will immediately feel cornered. It won't matter whether Iran ever plans to use the weapon. What will matter is that it could. That possibility alone is enough to make nations reconsider their long-term strategies, redirect resources toward weapons development, and double down on secrecy instead of transparency. Rational actors become defensive ones. Cooperation becomes caution. Trust, already in short supply, evaporates entirely. Take the Abraham Accords as an example. They represent a rare moment of diplomatic progress in a region historically defined by division. But agreements like these depend on stability. They rely on the assumption that dialogue is safer than confrontation. A nuclear Iran jeopardizes that assumption. It pushes countries into zero, some thinking, if one nation becomes untouchable due to its nuclear shield, others will look for similar guarantees, either through weapons of their own or through deepened military alliances that widen regional fault lines. There's also the impact on proxy conflicts. The Middle East has never lacked for local conflicts, many of which are fueled by external powers. But up until now, these have remained within a certain bandwidth of violence. A nuclear-armed actor backing a proxy force changes the risk calculus. What was once a manageable skirmish suddenly becomes a global concern. Other powers will step in more aggressively, not out of compassion, but out of fear that escalation could spin out of control. And history has shown that when multiple nuclear states become entangled in regional conflicts, diplomacy often gives way to posturing. Even outside of the direct military implications, the economic toll is significant. The perception of instability drives away investment, insurance costs rise, trade routes become vulnerable, tourism fades. Nations that were once working toward modernizing their economies will have to shift their priorities to defense and containment. The cost of doing business increases for everyone, and for a region already struggling with youth unemployment, water scarcity, and energy transitions, this diversion of focus is more than just inconvenient. It's damaging to long-term development. Some may argue that nuclear weapons have acted as deterrents in other regions, particularly during the Cold War, but that historical context doesn't cleanly apply to the Middle East. Unlike bipolar standoffs with clear red lines and relatively stable leadership, this region is shaped by multi-layered conflicts, asymmetrical power dynamics, and rapidly shifting alliances. In such an environment, even one misinterpretation could lead to disaster. The risk is not just escalation, it's accidental escalation. Regional stability is hard, won and easily lost. It depends not just on the absence of war, but on the presence of predictability. When leaders can predict each other's behavior, they can plan for peace. Nuclear weapons remove that predictability. They introduce a wild card, one that no one truly controls once it's on the table. The result is a region that's more nervous, more militarized, and less focused on the shared challenges that matter most to its people. The threat isn't just theoretical, it's structural, and once it enters the system, it doesn't just fade away. The damage is not a single explosion. It's a permanent state of fear that rewires how nations interact. And when fear becomes the dominant emotion guiding policy, progress becomes nearly impossible. The idea behind the global non-proliferation framework has always been rooted in a simple principle: that humanity is safest when the world agrees not to pursue weapons that can end it. This principle has held the international system together since the mid-20th century, guiding how countries engage with nuclear technology. It isn't perfect, but it has worked better than many alternatives. Treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT) were designed not only to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, but also to promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy and support disarmament by the nations that already possess these weapons. This balance has helped maintain global credibility until now. When a country defies that framework and ultimately succeeds in developing nuclear capabilities, the entire foundation begins to crack. The system depends on enforcement and trust. Once enforcement is seen as ineffective and trust is broken, the framework becomes more symbolic than functional. It stops being a barrier and becomes an outdated wish. The message sent to the rest of the world becomes dangerously clear. The international community may object, it may impose sanctions, but it won't stop you. And once that precedent is established, others start planning accordingly. A nuclear Iran is not just a regional challenge, it's a global systemic test. If Iran becomes a nuclear state after years of commitments, denials, inspections, and sanctions, it reveals deep weaknesses in the current system of containment. And this doesn't just embolden Iran, it emboldens every nation watching from the sidelines, countries that have stayed within the rules, not because they lack the capability, but because they trusted the global process will start asking themselves whether that restraint still makes sense. If the rules don't apply equally, then why follow them? The erosion is subtle at first. Nations begin investing more quietly in dual-use technologies, not admitting to any weapons program, but setting themselves up for one just in case. They negotiate less transparently, cooperate less willingly with inspections, and begin building alliances based not on values but on security guarantees. These behaviors don't announce themselves loudly. They emerge as hedges, technical research here, construction of a new facility there, a pause in cooperation framed as a domestic decision. But collectively, they represent a world slipping out of the grip of shared responsibility. There's also the institutional fatigue that sets in. Organizations tasked with enforcing nonproliferation, such as the IE, lose credibility when their findings are ignored or overruled by politics. Their technical assessments stop being levers for global action and become footnotes in long reports. Diplomats, after years of negotiations that go nowhere, lose momentum. The public starts tuning out. Apathy replaces urgency, and in that environment, violations become easier to hide or easier to justify. Another consequence is the fracturing of global unity. Right now, the nonproliferation framework rests on the idea that the world can speak in one voice when it comes to preventing nuclear spread. But in a post-nuclear Iran scenario, divisions emerge quickly. Some countries might tolerate it as a regional reality. Others might call for immediate sanctions or preemptive measures. The divergence in responses undermines the global front that once made proliferation costly. It creates room for strategic ambiguity, and with that ambiguity comes manipulation, miscommunication, and conflict. Perhaps most concerning is the generational impact. Younger leaders in emerging nations, those who didn't grow up during the Cold War, who haven't seen what nuclear brinkmanship looks like, might begin to see nuclear weapons not as a last resort, but as a ticket to recognition. If the last few decades told the story of disarmament, the next few risk telling the story of rearmament, and it will happen more quietly, more technologically, and more rapidly than before. There's still value in the global nonproliferation framework, but it only works if it adapts, if it can hold firm when tested, if it can enforce consequences with unity, not division, if it can inspire nations to choose cooperation over coercion. Without that, the framework doesn't just weaken, it decays. And when it decays, the risk isn't just one more nation with a bomb. It's the beginning of a world where the bomb becomes normal, expected, even strategic. The true strength of nonproliferation lies in the belief that progress doesn't come from power, but from restraint. Once that belief is lost, it's not just treaties that fall apart. It's the idea that some dangers are simply too great to risk, no matter who holds them. Innovation rarely blooms in the shadow of fear. It needs stability, freedom of movement, and an atmosphere where long-term thinking is rewarded, not punished. Peace is not just the absence of conflict. It's the presence of conditions where people can plan beyond tomorrow, invest in ideas that won't pay off for years, and collaborate across borders without suspicion. When paranoia takes over, when nations live in a state of alert, when governments redirect attention from progress to protection, the entire innovation ecosystem starts to decay. It's easy to underestimate how much peace influences innovation. Scientists need time and uninterrupted focus to solve complex problems. Entrepreneurs need predictable environments to raise capital and bring new products to market. Engineers need access to global talent and materials. Policymakers need room to think beyond defense budgets. None of these conditions flourish when nations are fixated on security threats that could erupt at any moment. Anxiety shortens time horizons. People don't think about building the future when they're constantly worried about surviving the present. A region in conflict tends to redirect its brightest minds away from creativity and into crisis response. Talent that could be working on energy breakthroughs or agricultural efficiency ends up designing surveillance systems and missile defense. That's not a judgment on those who do that work, it's a recognition that these are not the optimal conditions for developing solutions to humanity's biggest challenges. Progress doesn't just slow down, it reroutes. There's also a chilling effect on collaboration. One of the most powerful drivers of innovation is the free exchange of knowledge across borders. When countries are engaged in hostilities or deep distrust, this flow of information becomes constrained. Visas become harder to get, joint ventures dissolve, research partnerships go quiet. That's not just a loss for diplomacy, it's a loss for science. We've seen over and over that the biggest breakthroughs, from vaccines to clean energy to computing, often come from international teams. They happen when minds from different backgrounds approach a problem from multiple angles. That openness gets replaced by siloed thinking during times of paranoia. Markets don't react well to conflict either. Investors pull back, startups die in early stages, even established companies freeze R&D budgets because the risks are too high. Entire industries stagnate. Instead of racing to develop the next big innovation, economies start bracing for disruption. Instead of growth, you get survival, and that shift in mindset is costly, not just economically, but culturally. The fear economy has its own momentum. When a country believes it's under threat, it builds more weapons, hires more security contractors, and justifies surveillance measures that make openness harder. And once those systems are in place, they're not easy to dismantle. The tools built for emergency become permanent infrastructure. And while all this might seem necessary in the short term, it comes with a trade-off: less trust, less cooperation, and far fewer bold experiments aimed at helping the world solve real problems. Innovation demands risk, but it also demands a foundation of safety. You can't bet on a long-term vision if you think the world might fall apart in the near term. Nations under constant threat focus on short-term wins, not 10-year moonshots. They subsidize defense over education. They emphasize control over creativity, and over time, that shift becomes visible. Countries that were once centers of innovation fall behind. Young minds leave. Investments dry up. The infrastructure that supports experimentation begins to crumble. That's why the stakes around global peace aren't just humanitarian. They're deeply practical. Every conflict that diverts resources from innovation is a missed opportunity. Every crisis that shuts down international collaboration slows our collective progress. The more we normalize living in fear of one another, the more we delay the breakthroughs that could change everything: better cures, cleaner energy, smarter tools to navigate complex systems. It's tempting to frame peace as a diplomatic goal or a moral imperative, but it's more than that. It's a strategic asset. When people feel safe, they build. When they build, they solve. And when they solve, they lift not just their own communities, but the entire world. That's the real dividend of peace. Not just the quiet, but the progress it makes possible. We often talk about the cost of war, but we should talk more about the opportunity cost of peace not pursued. The cost of minds never freed to imagine, the ideas never pitched, the partnerships never formed. That's the quiet toll conflict takes, the one we don't see until it's too late. Throughout history, nations have relied on strength to deter threats. Military might, strategic alliances, and economic pressure have all played their roles in maintaining balance. But these tools have limits. They are resource-intensive, reactive, and often escalate problems rather than solve them. What's scalable, what actually grows in power as more people invest in it, is diplomacy. Unlike missiles or sanctions, diplomacy multiplies with use. It creates pathways instead of blockades, and in a world of increasing complexity, those pathways are more valuable than ever. The reason diplomacy works isn't because it's soft, it's because it's smart. It recognizes that conflict is rarely linear. Nations are driven by fears, interests, and internal pressures that don't always respond well to force. Diplomacy gets underneath the surface. It looks for levers of influence that aren't visible on a battlefield. When done right, it reduces the need for military deterrence by changing the behavior of adversaries before they become existential threats. It also avoids the false binary of appeasement versus aggression. Diplomacy is neither. It's a long game rooted in relationships, leverage, and timing. The most powerful thing about diplomacy is its compounding effect. Every time a negotiation succeeds, it becomes easier for the next one to take place. Relationships build trust, and trust builds momentum. Over time, that infrastructure becomes a deterrent in itself. Countries with open lines of communication and economic interdependence are far less likely to risk war, not because they've become friends, but because they've made themselves mutually valuable. It's a rational kind of peace, one that scales across regions and generations. In contrast, deterrence through strength eventually hits diminishing returns. You build more weapons, your rival builds more. You impose sanctions, they build workarounds. Every action invites a counteraction. The system becomes more brittle, not more stable, and the cost, it's astronomical. Billions poured into defense, while education, health, and infrastructure take a back seat. Diplomacy, by comparison, is cheap. It requires fewer people, fewer resources, and creates far more optionality. There's also the matter of adaptability. Modern threats don't always come from state actors. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, supply chain disruptions. These are tools of influence that aren't easily countered with traditional force. Diplomacy allows for flexible responses. It brings multiple actors into the conversation, from tech firms to NGO to regional influencers. It's not bound by the same rigid rules as militaries. That makes it nimble, which is essential in a world where the speed of disruption is accelerating. Diplomacy also doesn't require perfect alignment. It works even when countries don't fully agree. In fact, some of the most effective diplomatic efforts happen between rivals who share almost no values. What matters is shared interest, not shared ideology. If a country wants stability, access to markets, and legitimacy on the world stage, then diplomacy offers a path. It allows space for compromise without surrender and progress without provocation. It's important to understand that diplomacy isn't the absence of conflict, it's the management of it. That's what makes it sustainable. Unlike deterrence that relies on escalation readiness, diplomacy embraces ambiguity. It buys time, keeps doors open, and prevents mistakes from becoming wars. In a nuclear world, that flexibility isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. The margin for error has shrunk, the risks are higher, so the tools must be smarter. Critics often dismiss diplomacy as naive or slow, but slowness can be a strength when the alternative is rapid escalation. Diplomacy forces deliberation. It inserts process into emotion. It gathers facts. It creates accountability. These may sound like small things, but they're what prevent misunderstandings from becoming tragedies. If the world is serious about preventing the next major conflict, especially one involving nuclear actors, then diplomacy has to be the first, second, and third strategy. It's the only approach that doesn't create more problems than it solves. It's the only tool that scales without amplifying risk. And most of all, it's the only strategy that gives future generations a system worth inheriting. The real power of diplomacy is that it protects not just borders, but possibilities. It allows nations to focus on what they can build, not just what they can defend. And in a time when global challenges require more cooperation than ever, that's not a weakness. It's our greatest strategic asset. Because when the dust settles and the lines are redrawn and the next generation asks, why didn't they stop it? We'll need a better answer than silence. Let's give them one today.